It started as just a quiet shift in buying habits. One dairy shipment here, another there. Nothing that looked like a crisis. But then, the numbers came in, and the reality hit like a thunderclap. 8 countries, all major buyers of US milk and dairy products, had started pulling back. Some cut their orders by half. Others stopped buying altogether. And almost all of them had one thing in common. They were replacing US dairy with milk from Canada. For American dairy farmers, it was a nightmare they didn't see coming. For Canadian farmers, it was the beginning of what some are calling a golden dairy decade. But how did this happen? How did the United States, a dairy powerhouse, lose so many customers so quickly? And why did they all turn to Canada? The answer comes down to one word: tariffs. When the US slapped high tariffs on a range of imports, other countries hit back. They targeted US agriculture, and dairy was right at the top of their list. That meant American milk, cheese, butter, and yogurt suddenly became more expensive in global markets. Meanwhile, Canada's dairy prices stayed competitive, and their trade agreements gave them smooth access to these same countries. So when buyers went looking for an alternative, Canada was ready with open arms and open barns. Let's count down the 8 countries that made the switch. From number 8 to number 1. Number 8, Japan. Japan has always been a premium market for dairy. They don't just buy milk, they buy high-end cheese, butter for pastries, and specialty yogurts. For decades, US suppliers had a strong presence there. But tariffs made US dairy prices spike, and Japanese importers couldn't justify paying more when Canadian dairy was available at a better rate. Canada also had an advantage thanks to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which lowered tariffs on Canadian goods headed to Japan. Within months, Canadian cheesemakers were sending record shipments to Japanese supermarkets. Japanese bakers raved about the quality of Canadian butter. Even Japanese cafes began promoting drinks made with Canadian milk as a selling point. For the US, it was a clear sign that once a market gets a taste for Canadian dairy, it's not easy to win it back. Number 7, South Korea. South Korea loves dairy, but they're picky about it. They want clean, high-quality milk and cheese, and they want it at a good price. The US used to be a key supplier, but trade tensions changed everything. When the US introduced tariffs on Korean steel and tech products, South Korea responded with tariffs on American agricultural exports, including dairy. That opened the door for Canada. Canadian dairy co-ops moved fast, locking in contracts for milk powder, cheese, and even ice cream ingredients. Within a year, Canadian dairy exports to South Korea doubled. The switch wasn't just about politics, it was about reliability. Canadian suppliers guaranteed steady shipments, and South Korean buyers liked knowing prices wouldn't swing wildly because of trade disputes. Number 6, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is one of the fastest growing dairy markets in the world, with a big demand for milk powder, cream, and specialty cheeses. The US had been supplying much of that demand, until tariffs and political tensions made American dairy too expensive. Canadian exporters saw the opportunity and made their move. They offered competitive prices, halal-certified products, and a promise of long-term supply. Saudi food companies responded quickly, signing deals for Canadian milk powder and butter. Supermarkets in Riyadh and Jeddah began stocking Canadian cheese, and it became popular among consumers who wanted quality but didn't want to pay inflated prices. For the US, losing a wealthy and expanding market like Saudi Arabia was a painful blow. Number 5, Germany. Germany doesn't import huge amounts of basic milk. They produce plenty themselves, but they do import specialty dairy products. American cheese and milk protein powders had carved out a niche in the German market. But when the US raised tariffs on European goods, the EU, including Germany, responded with targeted tariffs on US agriculture. Almost overnight, American dairy became less competitive. Canadian exporters stepped in with specialty cheeses, whey protein for nutrition products, and milk powder for industrial baking. German importers liked that Canada's production standards matched their strict food safety laws, making the transition easy. Canadian dairy in Germany became a quiet success story, one that US farmers barely saw coming until the contracts were already gone. Number 4. China. China is a massive dairy importer, and for years, the US was one of its top suppliers. American milk powder, whey protein, and cheese for fast food chains were in huge demand, but the trade war changed everything. Tariffs on both sides pushed US dairy prices up, and Chinese buyers started shopping elsewhere. Canada was one of the biggest beneficiaries. Chinese bakeries began importing Canadian butter for their pastries. Canadian milk powder found its way into baby formula factories. Even Canadian cheese, once a tiny niche in China, began appearing in restaurant chains. The numbers were staggering. Billions of dollars in US dairy sales evaporated, and Canada's share of the Chinese market surged. Number 3. Mexico. Mexico is America's neighbor and one of its most important dairy customers. They buy huge amounts of milk powder, cheese, and butter from the US, or at least they used to. When the US slapped tariffs on Mexican steel and aluminum, Mexico hit back with tariffs on US agriculture, including dairy. Almost immediately, Canadian suppliers started moving in. Canadian cheese exports to Mexico rose by over 50% in a single year. Milk powder from Canada began replacing US shipments in industrial food production. And in some parts of Mexico, Canadian butter even became cheaper than local products. For US dairy farmers, losing market share in Mexico, a country so close, felt like losing to your own neighbor. Number 2. United Arab Emirates. The UAE imports almost all of its dairy products, and it prefers high-quality, branded goods. American dairy used to have a strong presence there, but when prices jumped, buyers started looking for new suppliers. Canadian dairy fit perfectly into the UAE's demand for premium products. Halal-certified Canadian milk powder, yogurt, and cheese began appearing in high-end supermarkets and hotels. The marketing was simple: pure Canadian dairy. For the UAE's luxury hotels and restaurants, Canadian dairy became the go-to option for quality without the political baggage of US tariffs. Number 1. India. India's dairy market is unique. They produce a lot domestically, but they also import specialty dairy products like milk powder and whey protein for the food industry. For years, the US supplied a big portion of that demand. But when the US imposed tariffs on Indian goods, India retaliated by raising tariffs on US dairy imports. That made American milk powder far too expensive. Canada stepped in with aggressive pricing and quick delivery. Indian food manufacturers liked that Canadian dairy met their quality standards and arrived on time. Within 2 years, Canada had overtaken the US in several key dairy categories in India. It wasn't just a trade shift, it was a trade takeover. The bigger picture of this trade dispute reveals a profound miscalculation. The tariffs, intended as a show of strength to protect US industries, ultimately backfired, especially in the crucial dairy sector. The policy directly drove major international customers representing billions of dollars in lost US dairy exports straight into the waiting arms of America's biggest competitor, Canada. For US dairy farmers, the impact has been nothing short of devastating. The sudden loss of these key export markets left them with empty order books and a massive surplus of milk. With far more supply than demand, milk prices plummeted, falling to levels that made it impossible for many farmers to earn a living. This created a vicious cycle of financial strain. Unable to sell their product at a viable price, farmers found themselves with mounting debt, struggling to pay for feed, labor, and equipment. The future for many became one of overwhelming uncertainty and fear, as the stability they had known for generations crumbled beneath them. For Canadian farmers, however, the situation was a complete reversal, a true windfall. With US suppliers no longer an option for many international buyers, Canadian dairy producers stepped in to fill the void. They quickly ramped up production and secured new trade relationships, opening up markets that had previously been dominated by the United States. This surge in demand brought a massive economic boost to Canada's rural communities, creating new jobs and revitalizing a sector that had long operated in the shadow of its larger southern neighbor. Mark Carney and Canadian trade officials have been quick to capitalize on this unexpected advantage. They haven't just accepted the new business, they've actively worked to secure it for the long term. By signing multi-year contracts, they are locking in these new relationships and providing a level of stability and trust that the U.S. has inadvertently forfeited. These contracts give both Canadian producers and their new international customers the confidence to invest in the future, knowing their supply chain is secure.